So everybody's realizing that the war in Ukraine is lost, that the Russians are going to win, and that it's an inevitability at this point. Let me just shift over just to get some better light. Yeah, and we see it from different perspectives, and it's really interesting. At Davos, for instance, Henry Kissinger, who he must be coming up on 100 years old, but Henry Kissinger, who's still extremely influential, said at Davos that the Ukrainian armed forces are wonderful and everything's going great, but it would be smart to start negotiating because Russia is an integral part of Europe and the European balance of power and security arrangements, and to continue with this war would cause irreparable harm to the relationship of Russia to Europe, and that what has to be prevented at all cost is an alliance between Russia and China. I mean, Henry Kissinger is basically saying negotiate now before it's too late. And reading between the lines of what he said, you realize that he's perfectly aware that Ukraine is losing militarily, because that's why everybody is starting to position themselves, because everybody realizes that Ukraine is losing militarily. Now, as you have Henry Kissinger and this whole, let's negotiate kind of track, and other people are saying it too, Poland is going down its track. I did a video of this a couple of days ago called Poland Slides It In. And they are basically trying to erase the border between Poland and Ukraine so that Poland can bring in its troops. And what they really want is Galicia and Lviv. That's what they really want. They want to take it over. They want that piece of Ukraine. And the Zelensky regime seems increasingly like it's going to give them that piece. I'm sure that it'll be in exchange for Poland giving guarantees to Zelensky personally and the little coterie of goons around Zelensky. I mean, I think that right now the Zelensky regime, the Zelensky himself and all of his goons there, they're all positioning themselves. That's my personal opinion, right? But anyway, the Poles are positioning themselves to bring in troops into Western Ukraine. Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, who recently won a landslide victory, no matter how you look at it, clearly with the wind at his back, insofar as Hungarian domestic politics is concerned, well, he's passing through the Hungarian parliament a bill that gives him emergency powers to make moves if there is an emergency, right? But what are these moves? They're military moves, see? And that's the key issue, because he wants to have the freedom and flexibility to be able to order around his troops, Hungarian troops, at a moment's notice. That's the key issue, okay? It's not for medical lockdowns or something like that. No. It's for troop movements in Hungary. And so what does this indicate? Well, Viktor Orban, Ukraine, current Ukraine, has pieces of ethnic Hungarians, Transcarpathia. The Transcarpathia region in southwestern Ukraine. You look at a map, it's way down here, by the Carpathian Mountains, right beyond the Carpathian Mountains, Transcarpathia. That's Hungarian area, or ethnic Hungarians live there, and they speak Hungarian. And because of accidents of the Warsaw Pact and the times of the Soviet Union, that piece was given to Ukraine. But the Hungarians want it just as much as the Poles want Galicia. And so clearly Orban wants his troops there. And clearly Orban is fighting the oil sanctions because, number one, it really would hurt the Hungarians to be cut off from oil, especially because, as has been pointed out by Alex Christoforou, that there are all kinds of mechanisms by which Alex Christoforou and Alexander Mercouris pointed this out. There are mechanisms by which Russian oil shipped by sea, can quickly evade the sanctions, whereas pipeline oil cannot evade those sanctions. And so because of it, because Hungary gets its oil via pipeline, Hungary in particular does not want the oil sanctions because the Germans and other nations can evade the sanctions ban, as they are doing, but the Hungarians would not be able to. And that's why they're throwing a spanner in the works. But anyway, that's a different thing. The Hungarians want their oil, but also, on the other hand, the Hungarians, Orban, they are very pragmatic, and they understand that Russia is going to be around, pretty much forever. It's always going to be a big nation. It's always going to be influential, if not a determinant factor in European politics, geopolitics. So Viktor Orban, smart man that he is, he knows that what he has to do is make nice with the Russians, stay on side with them, stay as friendly as possible with them. And I think that what he's thinking of is being able to have the flexibility to grab a piece of Ukraine once Ukraine starts to disintegrate. And I think that's the issue. It's not merely that Ukraine is losing this war. I think that there is an increasing number of people who are realizing in the West that Ukraine is going to disintegrate altogether. It is going to cease to be a nation state. And quite frankly, I was thinking that there's going to be a rump Ukraine state, but this rump Ukraine state it's going to be, just a puppet of somebody, of whatever power manages to snag Kiev. I personally think that the Russians realize that they cannot afford to have a rump Ukraine state controlled by NATO or the European Union. And so once they have annihilated the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbass, as they are doing, and this is a tragedy. This is a tragedy, but that's the truth of the matter. Once they have annihilated that army, they are going to, the whole thing is going to start to collapse. And I think that the Russians have every intention of using their enormous reserves of manpower to quickly secure this disintegrating country. I think that that's the goal. And it's not something that they anticipated. But the fact that that Kissinger, for instance, was talking about, negotiated settlement. And the New York Times also, in an editorial stated just a few days ago, I think it was 3 days ago, stated that, everything is wonderful in Ukraine, and Ukraine should, start negotiating and settling an end to this war. This war hasn't lasted that long. It's lasted 90 days. And if the Ukrainians were winning, nobody would be talking about negotiating a ceasefire and a permanent peace. It's because everybody realizes that the situation is collapsing. The situation is collapsing. Ukraine is going to disintegrate. If the pace continues at this pace, another 90 days, Ukraine will cease to exist as a nation, as a functioning geopolitical entity. Okay? As a nation state, it will collapse. And the Hungarians will take their bite, they'll chomp on Transcarpathia, and the Poles will take Galicia and Lviv, and perhaps even more of Western Ukraine. And Russia, well, they're going to take the east and the south. That's going to be theirs forever. And I think that the big rush will be who takes that central blob, where you have, Kiev roughly here, and it's like central and towards the west, up until it rubs up to over here, Galicia and Lviv, right? Galicia, the region, and Lviv, the city. It's going to be this little blob, roughly half to a third the size of the original Ukraine. And this blob, landlocked, it's going to be something that multiple players will want to grab hold of and control. I personally think that the Russians are going to be able to do it because they'll have the manpower to do it. But you have to understand that at the pace that we are going at now, and once the Popasnaya victory happened, the pace at which the Russian forces are just taking over in the Donbass, I think this is inevitable. And the other thing, too, that you've noticed is that many people, including Jens Stoltenberg, the imbecile president of NATO, or Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, I despise that man. He is an empty suit. He's one of those typical North Europeans who's so arrogant and yet so stupid. He's the epitome of Dunning-Kruger. He's one of those imbeciles who thinks that he knows everything, and he knows nothing. And because he thinks he knows everything, he is arrogant and dismissive and so insulting and condescending to everyone. Oof, I hate that kind of guy. I mean, just on general principle, it's the kind of guy that you want to punch in the face. Yeah. And if I ever run across Jens Stoltenberg, but I doubt it, I'd slap him for being just an imbecile, just on general principle. But anyway, even him, he's saying that NATO does not want to escalate. Nobody wants to escalate. Nobody wants to escalate, not seriously, because they've seen what the Russians can do, and they're scared of it. And the Pentagon and its outpost in Brussels at NATO, they've got a good look at what the Russians have done over the last 90 days, and it scares them. And I've said before, the Ukrainian armed forces was the best NATO army on the planet, better than the Americans. Because unlike the American army, the Ukrainian armed forces were actually battle-hardened. They'd fought in the Donbass, and they'd rotated units through the Donbass area. They'd actually done some fighting, and they were the best trained, best equipped, and the largest of all the NATO armies in Europe. And they're getting annihilated by the Russians. I mean, it's just, you have to understand the annihilation that we're seeing. People don't seem to understand it. In 90 days, the Russians have captured 150,000 square kilometers. That's how much territory they have captured. They have captured it and they hold it tight like a baby holding a rattler. And you have to understand how remarkable that is. And this in the face of incredibly intense and heroic efforts on the part of the Ukrainian armed forces. Nobody's questioning their heroism, their determination. No, they are best soldiers they are, and motivated. And they got annihilated. The Pentagon, NATO, they don't want any piece of that. And Jens Stoltenberg, yeah, he blusters and bluffs and bullshits, but he knows. They all know. And they all want a negotiation. Even Lloyd Austin is talking about negotiating. And so what does that tell you? I think that we are a lot closer than anybody in public realizes to the disintegration of the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, it could be within a matter of a week or two that the whole Ukrainian army just suddenly collapses. I've said this before. When an army collapses, it's not a gradual thing. It's all at once. It's just poof, and it just collapses. You look through history. Every single time when an army realizes that it cannot win a war, it just collapses. It just gives up. Discipline breaks completely. It's the typical tipping point. The Malcolm Gladwell issue, you know, that one little grain of sand and then the whole thing just goes poof. That's what I think we are about to see in Ukraine. That's why everybody is getting ahead of what's about to happen. Because it is about to happen. And I think it's going to be very interesting because this period of chaos inadvertently might be the most dangerous of them all if anybody makes a mistake. And so let's hope that the people who are running things, let's hope that these various factions that I've mentioned, let's hope that they don't do anything stupid. Because these next few weeks, they are going to be very intense.